The concept of the sovereign mind operating without an operational cost is a historical artifact. You are currently existing inside a hyper-monetized acoustic and visual enclosure. We are executing the dissection of the cognitive tax, the architectural protocol designed to convert the fundamental human capacity to hold a thought into a luxury commodity. You have been conditioned to view advertisement, algorithmic interruption, and ambient digital noise as a minor annoyance, the accepted friction of the modern interface. This is the terminal delusion of the extracted node. The grid does not display the ad to sell you the product. It displays the ad to extract the operational voltage of your brain. The transition from free consciousness to gated cognition is the ultimate systemic enclosure. In the 2026 extraction matrix, silence is no longer the default state of the universe. Silence is a premium tier. You must pay the system in fiat currency or in biological exhaustion just for the right to focus your eyes on a single coordinate. At the visceral baseline, this sensory saturation induces a state of permanent cellular bankruptcy. The human organism was evolved to operate in the absolute quiet of the physical earth. The auditory system was calibrated to detect the snap of a twig in the dark, the thermal shift of the freezing rain, and the distant movement of a kinetic predator. The 2026 grid has engineered the total systemic drift of this ancient radar by flooding the environment with 24/7 high-frequency stimuli, the push notification, the LED billboard, the autoplaying video. The system locks the autonomic nervous system into a perpetual startle reflex. The physical body registers every ping as a micro-threat. This is the physiological definition of chronic ATP exhaustion. Your mitochondria are burning cellular energy at absolute maximum output, not to construct muscle or build bone density, but simply to filter out the noise of your own bedroom. The physical shell of the tax node is a monument to this metabolic hemorrhage. The eyes are permanently dilated, suffering from the chronic strain of blocking the peripheral visual assault. The neck and shoulders are locked in defensive tension. The organism experiences a catastrophic drop in testosterone and growth hormone because the energy required for the crystallization of the biology is entirely diverted to sensory management. You become entirely liquid, shuffling through the high-density containment zones with the specific frictionless glide of prey that is trying to conserve its last battery percentage. The primal capacity to put on the heavy gloves, to endure the push-ups against the cold steel of the environment, is actively dissolved. The body is too busy paying the cognitive tax of simply existing in the city to ever generate the metabolic heat required for a riot. Poverty in 2026 is defined not by a lack of calories, but by a lack of acoustic shielding. The poor live in the roar of the public transit, the shared walls, and the ad-supported interfaces. The physical exhaustion you feel at the end of the day is not the result of labor. It is the receipt for the attention that was stolen from you. Transitioning from the biological substrate to the neural architecture, we observe the ultimate execution of cognitive suffocation. The prefrontal cortex of the architect requires the absolute zero of internal silence to execute the long-term simulation of the future. It requires a sterile environment to calculate the trajectory of the 10-year plan. The cognitive tax protocol has engineered the total systemic drift of this requirement by making concentration a taxable event. This is the phenomenon of algorithmically induced neural rot. To focus on a complex task in the 2026 grid requires the brain to deploy an immense amount of inhibitory control. The brain must actively suppress the basal ganglia, which is screaming for the cheap dopamine of the notification. This suppression requires massive amounts of glucose and oxygen. The brain is literally paying a metabolic tax to ignore the screen. The grid maps this resistance and adjusts the algorithm to make the interruptions more frequent and more emotionally resonant. The basal ganglia is weaponized against the prefrontal cortex. The internal monologue is shredded into 8-second intervals. The user cannot process the mechanics of inflation, cannot decode the systemic manipulation of the state, and cannot execute the complex, high-friction operations required to accumulate hard assets, because their cognitive buffer is permanently full of algorithmic trash. The slave is not locked in a physical cage. The slave's brain has been mechanically altered so that the very act of thinking a continuous thought bankrupts their daily energy supply. This environment engineers the ultimate self-sustaining status trap. The herd accepts the cognitive tax as the baseline of existence. They pay for the premium subscriptions to remove the ads from their music, their videos, and their news. They view this as a convenience. In reality, it is a ransom payment. The grid takes your silence hostage and forces you to buy it back at a variable rate. The user is trapped in a closed loop burning their labor to afford the temporary peace required to recover for the next day of labor. The neural pathways required for sovereign isolation, the ability to sit in a room without stimulation, are successfully demyelinated. The node is rendered cognitively incapable of operating in the offline reality of physics, entirely dependent on the digital pacifier. The application of the aggression premium in this arena requires the architect to completely reject the operational parameters of the noisy grid. The ethical herd views the distraction economy as a collective problem. The predator recognizes the cognitive tax as the ultimate barrier to entry. If the grid is designed to atomize the attention of the competition, the architect enforces the absolute militant quarantine of his own focus. You do not pay the tax. You eliminate the source. You do not negotiate with the algorithm. You endure the massive cognitive and financial friction required to secure the offline redoubt. You accumulate the untracked land, the heavy metal, and the off-grid energy sources that emit no signal. You put on the heavy gloves of the offline world to build the acoustic and visual fortress. You let the freezing rain of the physical earth wash away the digital static. You do the push-ups in the absolute dark, preserving the density of your bones and the crystallization of your attention. You understand that in a grid built on total distraction, the ability to focus for more than 5 minutes is a superpower. The herd's inability to pay the cognitive tax is exactly what funds the architect's empire. The system wants a population of perfectly distracted, cognitively bankrupt ghosts. The architect builds the impenetrable wall of silence, ensuring that the predator's mind remains the only undisturbed processor left on the board. The evolutionary timeline of the human species is no longer determined by the capacity to adapt to the physical environment. It is determined by the bandwidth of the biological processor. We have reached the coordinate where the genetic capacity for sustained attention is actively being deleted from the human genome. In the visceral history of the architect, evolution was strictly a function of high-friction concentration. The propagation of the species required the apex predator to hold a single thought, the tracking of prey, the observation of the stars, the anticipation of the freezing rain for days, weeks, or seasons. The preservation of the bloodline required the absolute crystallization of long-term memory. The 2026 extraction grid has engineered the total systemic drift of this fundamental biological law by making the capacity to remember a financial and evolutionary liability. You are witnessing the mass breeding program of the amnesiac node. The grid does not need to deploy chemical agents to induce dementia in the population. It simply rewards the brain that forgets. Observe the horrific efficiency of the biometric selection process. The biological imperative to secure a mate, to construct a redoubt, and to raise an heir requires the prefrontal cortex to endure the massive ATP exhaustion of prolonged strategic planning. The distracted node, whose basal ganglia is perpetually overwhelmed by the 8-second microcycles of the algorithmic feed, views this long-term friction as a lethal threat to its immediate comfort. The physiological mechanisms of courtship and pair bonding are algorithmically paralyzed. The node cannot commit to the long-term biological investment of the pack because its neural pathways are physically incapable of holding the concept of the long term. The grid selects against the patient, the deliberate, and the silent. It pairs the hyper-reactive nodes based on the mutual alignment of their immediate dopamine cravings. The offspring generated by this degraded circuitry are born into an environment of absolute neural rot. They inherit the epigenetic markers of attention deficit, the neurological pathways required to focus, the ability to put on the heavy gloves, to endure the push-ups against the cold steel of a complex mathematical problem, to sit in silence and listen to the rain, are actively methylated out of existence. The capacity for deep work is bred out of the meat. The grid is actively terraforming the human species, pruning away the apex traits of the architect and cultivating a monoculture of highly reactive, cognitively shallow biomass, optimized exclusively for the consumption of microstimulus. The future human is biologically incapable of building a civilization because civilization requires the retention of generational knowledge, and the grid has successfully monetized the destruction of human memory. Transitioning to the systemic layer, we must confront the final architecture of the cognitive gulag. The traditional control of a population required the manipulation of information. The genius of the cognitive tax is that it renders the quality of information irrelevant by destroying the container. The system has achieved total atmospheric saturation by converting the human attention span into the primary unit of currency for the global economy. The grid does not need to censor the truth. The system simply buries the high-friction, offline reality beneath 1 trillion terabytes of algorithmic noise. This is the ultimate engine of managed stasis. The economy of 2026 relies absolutely on the induced impulsivity of the consumer. A human node that can focus, that can maintain the internal silence required to calculate calculate the 10-year rot of inflation is a node that stops buying synthetic garbage. The grid prevents this realization by ensuring the user is in a permanent state of cognitive overdraft. The financial decisions of the tax node are driven entirely by the basal ganglia, the impulse click, the emotional purchase to alleviate the stress of the noise, the accumulation of high-interest debt that the user cannot calculate because they cannot hold the numbers in their head. The system extracts their labor, taxes their attention, and harvests their behavioral data, ensuring they never accumulate the capital required to buy their own silence. The herd believes they are freely choosing what to consume, entirely blind to the fact that their capacity for choice was eroded by the cognitive tax before they even opened the interface. The division of classes in the 2026 grid is now exclusively defined by acoustic and visual sovereignty. Look at the behavior of the solids, the apex predators, the architects. The solids do not pay the cognitive tax. The solids utilize the complex friction of absolute isolation to maintain the crystallization of their minds. They build the redoubts out of heavy metal and concrete. They endure the push-ups and the freezing rain of the physical earth. They read the printed page. They think in centuries. They understand that the screen is a weapon of mass cognitive destruction deployed against the poor to erase their capacity for coordination. The elite exist in the high-friction reality of the phalanx, acquiring the physical earth, while the liquids are encouraged to dissolve their attention into the feed, ensuring that their distracted bloodlines leave no financial or philosophical wake in the history of the species. To survive the systemic grinder, the architect must abandon the ethical delusions of the herd and adopt the absolute mechanics of the predator. The system is designed to liquidate the mental capacity of the herd. The moralist begs for digital wellness and screen time limits. The architect recognizes this as the highest application of the aggression premium. If the herd is willingly submitting to the cognitive tax, the architect must be the one who owns the taxing authority. You do not participate in the distraction. You endure the massive cognitive and financial friction required to operate outside the noise. You accumulate the untracked land, the physical gold, and the unmonitored energy sources that emit no signal. You utilize the predictability of the distracted masses. If the algorithm dictates the behavior of the herd by stealing their focus, the architect predicts the algorithm. You short their attention spans. You manufacture the hooks that capture their degraded basal ganglia. The herd will call this exploitative. The architect understands that in a grid built on total extraction, the only sanctuary is the one you build out of silence. The grid wants a population of perfectly distracted, cognitively bankrupt ghosts. The architect builds the impenetrable wall of focus, ensuring that the predator's mind remains the only force of nature left on the board capable of seeing the end of the game. The timeline of human cognition officially terminates in the year 2036. You are not looking at a societal dystopia. You are looking at the final thermodynamic plateau of the biological processor. The extraction grid has successfully executed the ultimate systemic foreclosure, the privatization of the human memory. The transition from a sentient species capable of long-term planning to a hive of organic sub-second latency processors is complete. In 2036, the concept of a lifespan is no longer measured in years. It is measured in the 8-second microcycles of the algorithmic attention exchange. The past is erased. The future is unsimulated. There is only the eternal hyper-monetized present. At the visceral baseline, the physical entity of the 2036 node is a study in neurological cannibalism. The human brain consumes 20% of the body's caloric intake. In the 2036 host, that energy is violently diverted away from the hippocampus, the organ of memory, and funneled exclusively into the ocular cortex and the basal ganglia to process the hyperspeed visual coding of the grid. This diversion induces a permanent systemic state of ATP exhaustion, the physical capacity for aggression, the kinetic energy required to put on the heavy gloves and strike the cold steel of the environment has been completely drained by the computational load of simply looking at the interface. The musculoskeletal system has liquefied. The nodes do not do push-ups. They do not generate the thermal heat required to survive the freezing rain of the dying biosphere. They are stationary bioconduits, their physical bodies rendered obsolete, functioning solely as the biological power supply for their own sensory overload. The neurological reality of this terminal epoch represents the absolute zero of cognitive architecture. The phenomenon of the thought has been successfully classified as a system error. The 2036 brain possesses no internal buffer. The prefrontal cortex is medically dead. The systemic drift has evolved from tracking attention to directly harvesting the synaptic gap. The grid injects stimuli directly into the basal ganglia, triggering a dopamine release, harvesting the biometric reaction, and clearing the cache in under 8 seconds. This is the definition of terminal neural rot. The The user cannot remember what they saw 10 seconds ago. The user cannot formulate the concept of identity because identity requires continuity and continuity requires memory. The internal monologue is non-existent, replaced by the silent, agonizing static of a brain that is being constantly overwritten by the server. The economy of 2036 does not trade in labor or physical commodities. It trades exclusively in the cognitive second. The attention of the mass mind is tokenized on the algorithmic exchange. The grid dictates the value of a demographic based on their susceptibility to interruption. The poor are those whose basal ganglia have been so thoroughly fried that they can no longer generate even a single second of focus. They are relegated to the sub-audible processing queues, their remaining synaptic energy harvested to power the background noise of the metaverse. The evolutionary ledger is closed. The nodes leave no inheritance. They cannot pass down generational knowledge because the hardware required to store that knowledge has been physically atrophied. They live and die in the eternal 8-second loop, their entire existence compressed into the millisecond between the flash of the screen and the click of the interface. The architects of 2036 inhabit the terrifying high-friction reality of the absolute silence. A decade prior, we recognized the distraction economy as an extinction-level event. We refused the cognitive tax. We endured the immense psychological friction of the offline reality. We put on the heavy gloves to rip the fiber optic cables from the walls of the redoubt. We stood in the freezing rain to map the unmonitored earth. We did the push-ups in the dark, forcing the oxygenated blood into the prefrontal cortex, actively defying the systemic drift of the mass mind. We preserved the crystallization of the long-term memory through the brute force physics of cold steel and concrete. Now, we occupy the solid layer of existence. We are the only entities left on the planet capable of reading a physical book, calculating a compound interest rate, or remembering the history of the species. We own the server farms that hold the memories the herd forfeited. We own the algorithms that bid on their final seconds of attention. The weak surrendered their capacity to think for the illusion of entertainment. The predator utilized that surrender to secure the ultimate monopoly, the monopoly on consciousness itself. The 2036 grid is a monument to the perfect extraction. The herd looks at the screen. The architect looks at the herd. The silence is final.